and other fragile situations today. I'm going to kick us off really quickly by introducing someone who's going to make some opening remarks for us before we get into the meat of the session, and that's Shantanu Mitra, who is a director's advisor, which is difficult to understand what that means, but he's an advisor to ADB, who is essentially the UK government and FCDO's person who provides that strategic linkage between the UK government and ADB. Is that a good enough explanation of your job? Great. Shantanu, why don't you come up and give us some opening remarks? Thanks.
Well, thanks very much, Rachel, and great to see everyone. So just firstly to welcome all of you, and it's great for the UK. We're really happy to be co-hosting this with the IOM, which has a strong track record on promoting social protection in fragile and conflict-affected contexts. And we're really, really also happy, and particularly with being the UK's representative, and only for the last few weeks now on the ADB board, great to see the ADB's commitment to this agenda. And I think this is the third time ADB, if I'm right, has organised this event. So the feedback I've been hearing from people has been that it's been a really great event. So that says a lot about ADB's commitment to this agenda. And I would say that it's particularly timely and important now, perhaps more than before, because all the multilateral banks, including ADB, are increasingly being pushed by their major shareholders and others in the international community to evolve their approaches, their instruments, their capacities for dealing with global public goods and global crises. And I would certainly include fragility and conflict in that set of issues. So the onus is on the banks, including ADB, to show how they're responding and upping their game on that agenda. So it's, I hope that a lot of good ideas will come out of this and help ADB to move forward. So this agenda, it's a really important one for FCDO and our partners in the region. And I think, as you'll all know very well, it's an increasingly important issue in the region. I mean, obviously, there's some countries, Afghanistan, Myanmar, issues in Bangladesh, Mindanao, and it's an emerging issue in many other countries as well. So these are clearly some of the most difficult political and operating environments for development actors like ADB and others. I mean, in some of these countries, constraints such as not being able to work through government systems and having to go outside of those. How does that constrain the approach, and how do you react and respond to that? Yet they're the most difficult context, but they're also the contexts which have the most vulnerable people. So it's even more important that we actually think hard about the approaches. I would say that, for this session, as my understanding is, I'm not an expert in this, but I do talk to our people, our experts in London, and people like Rachel, that there are two basic premises for this session. One is that there's a growing and strong need for comprehensive and effective social protection to help protect the most vulnerable from the increasing crises, economic, climate, conflict, that are occurring in the world with increasing frequency. And there's actually a strong and increasing evidence base on the effectiveness and the potential of social protection. So that's the first issue. And the second premise, I think, is that not enough is being done, and particularly when governments are facing fiscal crises, debt distress, the amount of investment in improving the capacity and the coverage and the effectiveness of social protection has been inadequate. So I think that, to me, is perhaps the starting point for the conversation. I'll just briefly finish up in saying that the UK has been a strong supporter of this agenda for a number of years. We're not the only ones, but I would say we've been one of the most active international partners. And one particular initiative we have is the Basic Assistance in Crises program, which has been set up to support capacity building, to support the development of plans, policies, programs to generate knowledge and disseminate knowledge, and to support and provide a platform for cooperation. And I'm delighted that Rachel, heads the basic research program, has been able to be here and to moderate this session, and I'm sure Rachel will be sharing some of the lessons from basic. So that's all I wanted to say, really, and really looking forward to hearing a lot of good ideas about how social protection can be scaled up, not only scaled up, but made more effective in helping to reduce and prevent crises, and also designed in a way which itself is sensitive to specific conflict situations. And I hope also that out of this session and the rest of the week, there'll be a lot of good ideas for new opportunities and partnerships that can be followed up. So let me stop there and hand back to you, Rachel.
So if we could move on to the introductory PowerPoint, please. So as Shan's just said, my name's Rachel Slater, and I work on the research program that he's just been describing, the Better Assistance in Crisis basic program. And I'm going to be facilitating today's session, trying to bring in some of the findings that we have from our research program and think about how they apply in the Asia-Pacific region. If we go to the next slide, please. So what we're really talking about, sorry, back one, is how do we make our social protection more effective, and how do we make it more conflict sensitive and displacement inclusive? I'm just going to map out what we're going to do today. So if we move on to the next slide, I'm going to start off by just flagging some of the landscape that we have in the Asia-Pacific region in terms of conflict and displacement, to consider the context and the challenges that we're facing. I'm then going to pitch 4 questions about conflict-sensitive and displacement-inclusive social protection. And I'll go through those questions with you now, and then we'll be getting perspectives, experiences, and new ideas from the experts that we'll bring up onto the panel. And then after that, we'll have some Q&A time. So next slide, please. In terms of the landscape that we're talking about, sorry, can you click onto the next slide? That's it, thanks. In terms of the context that we're talking about, I want to start off by saying that Asia and the Pacific are conflict affected. I've talked to a few people at this meeting and they've said, oh, what are you doing here? What are you going to be focusing on? And I've said conflicts, and they've said, oh, that's nothing to do with the country that I work in. And I've gone, So we can look across the region. We can see international conflicts between different countries. We can see non-international conflicts taking place in a particular country that are perhaps nationwide. We can see non-international conflicts that take place among different factions within a country at a sub-regional level. We can also see countries that have a post-conflict landscape, places like Nepal, where there's been conflict in the last few decades. And then we've got regional impacts. And I thought, if you look at this quote about Afghan refugees, 8.2 million Afghans hosted across 103 different countries in the world. I thought we'd play a little game that I call stand up, sit down. If you're not able to stand up, maybe you can put your hands in the air for us. Okay, so if everybody would like to stand up, we're going to have a quiz about whether we're conflict affected or not. So the first thing is, if you live in a country that has an active conflict, or is at war with another country, or a conflict with another country, sit down, please. Okay, if you live or work in a country that has refugees from another country, sit down, please. No. You're going to hear about Afghanistan in a moment from our colleague over there. So we've got some countries left. You're perhaps not as directly impacted by conflict as some of the others that we've heard about, but how many of you live in countries where you've had food price increases since Russia invaded Ukraine? Or fuel price increases since Russia invaded Ukraine? Okay, so I'm hoping that I have made my points. Wherever you live in the Asia-Pacific region, you are in one way or another, your economy in one way or another, your politics in one way or another are affected by conflict. So next slide, please. This matters for all of us. And yet, people sometimes think that this isn't an issue for us to be considering. For me, the challenge is that most social protection policies and programs in this region pay little attention to conflict until they're forced to by a particular set of circumstances. Our policies and programming are often conflict blind, they're not conflict sensitive, we're not ready to deliver our programs in a situation where there's an outbreak of violence. And we tackle displacement outside of our existing or in parallel to our existing social protection programs, not as a full part of them. The other thing that I note that whilst in some of the other sessions you'll have heard all about these increasing relationships between people working on social protection and people working on disaster risk management, yeah, we've got those linkages are happening. Are we then linking that into people who work on peace and security? Not very much. And I think that sometimes we talk about in the fragile and conflict-affected situations settings, commitments to state building, to national ownership and national systems, but we don't really pay enough attention to some of the dilemmas that we find when we try to support states that are party to a conflict and indeed might be a predatory actor in a conflict. And we tend to focus not as much as we should on some of the political challenges of delivering social protection in these situations, and instead we get fixated on the technical challenges. And I was looking through some of the ADB documents about its forward activities on social protection, and there's lots of talk about crisis, lots of talk about shock responsive, but almost all of it is in relation to climate. That we're not saying enough about conflict at the moment. So next slide, please. I've got 4 questions for us today. The first is, how can non-state actors, so NGOs, international agencies, and so on, support social protection in situations where cooperation and coordination with government is constrained? The fact sheet here tells us that ADB has suspended its operations in Afghanistan and is seeking other ways of providing support there. But one of the things that we find is that in these situations, we start routing our funding through a humanitarian actor. But if you go back to university and do Social Protection 101, the first thing that you learn is that if it's not government-led, it's not social protection. So what do we do in these kinds of situations? What are some of the more nuanced ways of operating that we can find? Let's move on to the next slide, please. The second question asks specifically about subnational conflicts and about subnational levels of government. So what models do we have for working with and through local government that show a lot of promise for tackling impacts of subnational conflicts? The key thing for me is that we go back again to Social Protection 101, which tells us that social protection is a national thing, that we need to create national programs, national rights and entitlements. But what do we do when a subnational conflict situation means that we might have different levels or types of vulnerability, different levels or types of need emerging because of conflict? And what do we do when we want to try and have more devolved, flexible approaches? So how can we meet those local needs, those specific things that emerge because of conflict? That's our second question. If we move on to the next slide, please. Our third question, I saw a statistic a couple of weeks ago when I was thinking about what we were going to do in this session, and it said that 97% of displacement in this region is due to climate. And yet, the ICRC tells us that nearly 2/3 of the 20 countries in the world most vulnerable to climate change are also disrupted by armed conflict. So what happens when we have these different shocks and stresses overlapping one another? Can we identify what's happening? Can we identify what people need? Are there challenges associated with that? And I went through the ASEAN guidelines for disaster responsive social protection routes. Barely mentions conflict at all. There's a lot of focus on overlapping shocks, but it's COVID plus climate. And again, not enough attention paid to conflict. So final question, and this is the one where I don't know if we'll get to answers, but at least we'll start raising this. How could a regional approach to social protection and conflict contribute to supporting vulnerable groups, especially displaced people? So ADB a few years ago said, building a fragile country's resilience involves a long process, and it stresses country leadership, participation, and ownership. And if that's your perspective on how you work in fragile and conflict situations, how do we then square that with delivering social protection in different ways? So we're going to try and pick up on that question as well. That's all that I'm going to say for now. We're going to bring up our speakers onto the panel, and each of them is going to help us by focusing in on a particular question. So if I can ask you to all come up, and I'll start introducing you. Thank you. We're going to ask everybody to try and sit more or less under their name, and I'm going to sit under Shantanu's name and look a bit different, not quite so beardy. I'll be okay, thanks. Okay, so we're going to hear first from WFP's Deputy Regional Director for Asia and the Pacific, Samir Wanmali. Samir has only recently come back to his current post in the region, but has 20 years of experience in multiple different contexts globally, including working as a regional head of program here for a number of years. He's going to share some WFP experiences from a number of different contexts, including Afghanistan. And I hope he's going to help us focus particularly on answering that question number one. What do we do when it's really, really hard to work with the existing government or state? Samir, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, and good afternoon. Thanks very much. Just a few facts and figures that you're going to hear over and over again from WFP staff. So food insecurity, hunger, and malnutrition are on the rise. Conflict, climate changes, the knock-on effects of COVID, and the Ukraine war has resulted in a sharp increase in both acute food insecurity and a compounding of existing vulnerabilities in middle-income countries. So, number one, the basic staple of many societies of food is getting out of reach for the large majority. Over 70% of the globally food insecure live in conflict and protracted conflict settings. So that's the second data. Within this region, I think your point about the perceptions of conflict and violence in this region also coincide with this region's massive economic growth that's happened over the last 25 years. So when we talk about conflict, no, it doesn't happen in Asia. We're talking about active interstate conflict in the Sahel, in the Horn. But it has happened here, and it continues to happen in this region. And then you have other forms of violence that arise due to inequality and inequity. Sri Lanka. I think we were very unprepared, or perhaps it took us by surprise, how quickly that situation escalated, where yes, it was perhaps not due to a traditional set of factors that affect conflict, but it was due to some level of grievance, and I think that's really important. We approach social protection in WFP in a really interesting way, because I am going to perhaps say something controversial. Some of the things that we do in the humanitarian space actually are replicable in the development space. We say that food insecurity or food security is governed by investments in human development, education and health, in nutrition, in livelihoods and income generation, in looking at now increasingly focusing on women, because we know that if you invest in women's education, you will have food security outcomes that are much better than not. And increasingly, we're looking at climate and resilience. We're talking about traditional, let's say, academic subjects that are not always considered to be in the humanitarian sphere. Yet for WFP's program, we look at social protection as a mosaic of interventions ranging from cash-based transfers to social protection systems that you have, such as in this country, the 4P program, to looking at nutrition and health interventions with partners, to looking at rebuilding communities whose infrastructure has been destroyed by conflict or climate, to rebuild the means, their assets, to go back and engage in productive livelihoods and get access to food. So we look at this as a pastiche. It is, for us, several areas that cover different vulnerabilities and different needs. And in conflict and post-conflict countries and in protracted conflict countries, context matters, and you're not going to have one size fits all. And I think that's really important, because while you may have common principles of engagement of how we look at social protection, you won't have the blueprint, and you won't be able to do the cut and paste. I'm just going to illustrate 3 countries. In Afghanistan, you know our principal response is a humanitarian response. It's cash, food, it's specialized nutritious products for children under 2, for pregnant women. But more recently, we have worked with the World Bank and are now looking at a very particular targeted transfers for women and young children, because they have become extremely vulnerable in the current context in Afghanistan. Not just at a time when the administration changed. This has been coming over the last 3 to 5 years because of the successive climate shocks and the internalized conflicts that Afghanistan has had. In Myanmar, an extremely restrictive environment, we're trying to, again, focus on children and women, those who are going to be most affected by not accessing food, and you will see nutrition outcomes. And they're also looking at cash, but in peri-urban areas of Yangon. And then finally in Bangladesh, it is certainly the role that we're working with UNHCR and others to handle the Rohingya population. And with them, I think what we have is the closest thing that we're going to be able to get to a cash-based transfer program using humanitarian cash and translating that into a safety net for 800,000 people in that area. So these are the things that we're doing. What's extremely important in these contexts is that we can't look at these as one-off humanitarian time-bound interventions. These investments that WFP has made with others are intended eventually to set up the architecture so that the building remains when we leave. It's not just putting up the plywood and taking it down when you go. So let me stop there and then hand over to others. Thank you.
Lovely, thanks so much. So I guess the thing there that really resonates for me is this idea that we can do things in the humanitarian space that are developmental in nature. I think often when we're talking about social protection, it must be government, it must be development, and I think working in a conflict setting starts to make me think, do we need to think a bit more nuanced about that? It's either social protection or it's not. It's either development or it's not. So I think it'd be perhaps good to follow that up with listening to Jawad Aslam, who's been working in a space where development and humanitarian intersect since 2002. He's currently Chief of Social Policy at the UNICEF office in Afghanistan and leads on social protection, child policy, data analytics, and the evaluation portfolio. But more recently, he's led UNICEF teams working on similar issues and country-driven social protection reforms in a number of places, Myanmar in particular, and I'm hoping we're going to hear about some of those experiences. So get ready, that clock is starting and it's counting down in thousandths of a second.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thanks, Jawad.
Yeah. So my few points from today is based on my practitioner experience in Myanmar, Sudan, and Afghanistan in last 4 years. And I want to exactly pick up where Samir actually closed his discussion. So the main issue is politics. And in number of places, because of political landscape, state is taken over by a group, maybe taken over by the army of that country. Conflict starts, civil war, and in some instances we see a more widespread peace because of this, comparing it with the previous situation. And suddenly all the humanitarian and development partners, which are many of them, almost everyone is in this room, or all of us are from that group, we suddenly come to a situation, what we call de facto situation, and we go into non-engagement situation. And here, two things happen. One main thing happens immediately. The national system comes to a halt, and a parallel systems kick in. I use the word systems here, which means we all have our own systems to respond to this situation, and that all of them kick in with this situation. The basics is that we will not engage de facto authorities, we do not work with the national system, and then we implement directly. Now here there are two models we have seen in two countries. One is Myanmar, where there was a national system of social protection, but because of that political incident or event, we cannot work with it. Now what is the learning over there? The learning is that whatever we, UNICEF, WFP, and all the other humanitarian and development partners are implementing, they continue on the policy framework and design of the social protection program to respond to this situation. This is the main point in my experience from Myanmar. Now the second situation is Afghanistan, where there was no national system, but we are responding we respond to it. Now what you respond to it is what exactly Samir has closed his point, and which I want to emphasize. You lays the basis of the foundation of developing the national social protection system in future. So whatever you do, you should keep it in mind that this will be the foundation of the national social protection system in that country. Now building on these 2 points, in Afghanistan, and I think many of you have personally asked me, so let me a little bit touch upon it. Once you are doing it, I think the women and children group, we all know, and all of us work with this particular group, but in situation of Afghanistan, it becomes what the design of the program is empowering women and engaging particularly women in this program. This is one. Now in that model, two things are what we do and we encourage that should be kept in mind. One, you link up with some services which are life-saving, for example, health and nutrition services. And second, you bring in a strong component on social and behavior change, because that's important piece within social protection landscape which will make the difference. Third point is that you work with the community structures which are existing. So state structures might stop, but then community structures are over there that we all can engage in that landscape. For example, we work with grandmothers. You know, so it's not something in the literature or something, but that's what is there, and this is a particular group that we engage in that particular landscape. My two last points are, so now while you are working on this, the design is very important. What in Afghanistan, in a situation where there is no system, what design you put in place. Please don't forget few things while you are doing it, because that will lay the foundation of it. One, don't forget that you have to lay the foundation of a universal design for future, that the program has to go at scale and it has to cover large population. And already colleagues in other sessions has talked about life cycle. The other thing which I wanted to say, particularly after listening to some sessions, is no conditions. That might be, instead of conditions, that might be a point for us to consider, that don't put in place a system which encourages conditions. This is one. The other thing is on design also, humanitarian phase, in my view, is a rich phase. There is a lot of money. Red clock is clicking, so I just take few seconds. Humanitarian phase is generally very rich, but now you have to develop a system which will be a nexus from humanitarian to development. Over there in the design, keep it in mind that what you are going to pay as a social protection measure is something scalable and something to be given to government and sustainable in the future. Last point, design-wise, it is easy to transfer to government, but one area particular where we know we are struggling as UN agencies, that is related to management information systems. Now, what models we have developed, unfortunately, it is just a confession that they are not very easy to transfer to any government in future. So an idea around that we develop whatever model, it should be open source and something we can transfer to government in future. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. I think what we've heard stresses to us that if we're trying to route social protection through humanitarian actors, this isn't just a cheating way of doing an emergency humanitarian response and pretending it's okay and calling it social protection. What you hear from those examples are real commitments to making sure that you leave a social protection system in place. And for me, that's what makes it different to being just a straight humanitarian response. Now, we just heard Jawad talk about the idea of when you can't work with the national state, can you work lower down? And I think one of the things that we'd like to pick up on now in a slightly different way is that question too on how can you work at a subnational level and how can subnational level governments help us to implement more effectively. And there's no better person that I'd like to hear about that from than Laika. So Laika Serenis is currently the Chief of Staff in the Ministry of Social Services and Development, in the government, in the Bang Samora Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao. Now, if you're not from here, I'll just go over that again, because there's going to be acronyms flying, okay? So MSSD is the Ministry of Social Services and Development, and when Laika talks about BARM, she's referring to the Autonomous Regional Government in Muslim Mindanao. So BARM and MSSD. I'll hand over to Laika now.
Okay, thank you, Rachel. I prepared a few notes just to ensure that I don't go over the time. But just to give a context also, after more than 4 decades of armed conflict and lengthy peace negotiations, the transition period in the BARM provides a historic opportunity to address a myriad of challenges, from high poverty to recurring displacement due to armed conflict, clan feuds, and even displacement due to natural disasters. There is a high expectation from a population of almost 5 million people, majority of whom are Muslims, in a Catholic majority country, most of whom are found in the most geographically isolated and depressed areas. Okay. But as a result of the fiscal autonomy of the BARM, MSSD has been able to develop a number of strategic landmark social protection programs that may not be present anywhere else in the country. And this include the following. No? We have a social pension for PWDs, or persons with disabilities, where we provide a monthly disability allowance. We have been able to reach almost 50,000 PWDs every year. No? We also provide monthly financial support for orphans, most of whom are orphans of war. We have a flagship development program called Unlad Pamilyang Bangsamoro, which roughly translates to development of Bangsamoro families, where we target to improve the levels of well-being of the poorest households in the BARM by providing a set of interventions, including livelihood seed capital, educational assistance, skills training, rice subsidies, and medical assistance during crisis situations. For 2023, we have expanded this to prioritize the Sama Bajau. This is a nomadic ethno-linguistic group, most of whom are found in the island provinces in the region, and they have had the least access to basic social services. Since 2022, we have been, along with our development partners, we have been implementing a free birth registration program that targets children between 0 to 12 years old from indigenous communities to improve their access to education and healthcare. The ministry is also mandated to lead the disaster response, no? And we have managed to enhance our disaster response by providing a more comprehensive package of welfare goods. Our standard package right now, food packs, is at 25 kilos of rice compared to the national government's 5 or 6 kilos standard package. So ours is at 25 kilos of rice already. We are also providing dignity and protection kits, including underwear, no, for boys, girls, women, and men, whistles, solar lamps to address their protection needs. No? Baby kits, we are extremely proud of this, where we place the items for babies in a big plastic box, which can also serve as a flotation device during floods. No? So we have water kits, cooking kits, etc. We are also able to provide emergency shelter assistance using cash and vouchers, wash-in emergencies, an anticipatory action program that allows us to provide multi-purpose cash assistance prior to a potential disaster. You know? We have also worked on improving the processes of our social protection programs, including the adoption of digital solutions, including a beneficiary data management system to help us validate and verify the identity of eligible beneficiaries or households, do the duplication and cross-matching across our different programs, and help us record the depth and reach of our programs under one platform. We are working on a poverty registry system that takes into account the context of the region, including displacement, vulnerabilities, even the aspect of having polygamous families recognized. This will enable the flow and management of information to ensure a more responsive, equitable, and inclusive distribution of resources. We are piloting digital payments beyond what is currently being used by the national government's conditional cash transfer program by using e-wallets and remittance centers in addition to the traditional government banks. We are working with community-based parasocial workers and paralegals to improve our social service workforce. All these are part of the investments to set the foundation for an institution that is robust, responsive, has integrity, and hopefully excellence. Much remains to be done, but we remain hopeful and focused on our goal of uplifting Bangsamoro lives towards durable peace and development in the region.
Thanks so much, Laika. I think one of the things that I take away from hearing Laika speak is both optimism and inspiration, but also a reflection that too often we make lazy assumptions about capacities at local level in autonomous new governments and so on. You know, I'm getting a bit fed up of hearing international agencies say there's no capacity, right? And you listen to Laika talk, there's stacks of capacity. And I think one of the things that happens is that when we talk about capacity, we don't differentiate between what I'd call competency, which is, do you know how to design a proxy means test in order to create an algorithm and so on to do your targeting, or do you know how to set up a registry, with can you operate in a difficult situation and get your job done when the power goes out, when you're having to negotiate your way across a red line in a conflict situation. And what I see when I hear Laika talk about what she does is enormous capacity to adjust and adapt and deliver those sorts of functional skills that enable you to get stuff done alongside those other technical hard skills. And so it's really inspiring to see the kinds of capacity that there are within autonomous and local government levels. So thank you ever so much. We're going to move on again and start to think a little bit more about some of the questions that we put up later. So question 3 around what happens when shocks compound and combine, and some of those questions about regional. And I'm going to invite Tristan now to share some of her experiences and perspectives on those topics with us. She's going to focus on those questions about shocks when they intersect and help us think about how we find solutions through regional actions and cooperation. So Tristan, as a way of introduction, is the chef of mission for the International Organization for Migration in the Philippines. But I want to flag that she was previously Deputy Director of the Department of Operations and Emergencies at IOM's headquarters. And there she was coordinating IOM's humanitarian response to conflict and natural disasters and its movement and resettlement operations. Thanks so much, Tristan.
Thank you. I think I picked the short straw because I got 2 questions and 5 minutes, but I'll do my best. building off of what my colleagues have already mentioned. But indeed, you know, compounding shocks and stressors do pose a really significant challenge for designing an effective social protection policy and programs, and they do require a comprehensive and adaptive approach. Situations are fluid, they're context specific, and they require community engagement to identify needs and identify what is appropriate and what works in that particular context. So those programs need to be carried out in parallel with peace building, with DRR, so disaster risk reduction, as well as humanitarian strategies. And on the latter, in terms of humanitarian, we talk a lot about the humanitarian development and peace nexus, or the HDPN for everybody who loves acronyms here. And what that really means in practice is that we initiate development initiatives at the start of a crisis alongside humanitarian programming so that we are looking towards longer-term resilience. And what we're talking about in terms of social protection, that's really gearing towards that. Now, there are lots of frameworks. There's international frameworks. There are SDGs. There's the GCM. There's the GCR. There is the UN Action Agenda on internal displacement. I know you put cross-border up here, but internal displacement. And some of those, you know, the 3 potential solutions for resolving situations of displacement is return, relocation, or integration. But when do you actually know when that displacement has ended? Is when you have equal access to rights and services as the rest of the population. And that still remains to be seen. We haven't talked about the time duration, but we're still talking about how to ensure that access. So there is a joined-up approach that is required between development and peace actors. There is a role for IFIs and development banks and traditional donors to make sure that those funding mechanisms, and it's not only about money, but that their funding mechanisms are actually poised to inject funds for programming that is happening in parallel in a context that is humanitarian but requires more of a development focus. So in this region, you've already heard it's at arguably, Philippines is arguably at the top in terms of many of the climate shocks. There's slow onset, there's rapid onset. When you take situations of protracted displacement where you already have vulnerability, where you already have people that are competing for resources, and then you get hit with a typhoon or a mudslide or a landslide. There's also displacement because of land development. And then having that identification of relocation areas or perhaps a node build zone. So there's many layers of the analysis that needs to go into the longer term solution, but also how do we develop those social protection policies and what is appropriate. So a couple of recommendations in this regard is, one, making sure that those social protection programs are flexible and adaptable so that they can apply to changing circumstances, which includes mechanisms where you can rapidly scale up when there are multiple shocks, and adjust the eligibility criteria for those that will include all crisis-affected populations, including those crossing borders. One, and I'm glad that you raised this is at the forefront of humanitarian discussions, is engaging communities. One, it's an accountability measure, but it also is better programming. 3 is recognizing and examining the linkages between climate change, conflict, including climate-induced stressors, and their potential for exacerbating vulnerabilities among populations that are already impacted by conflict or reoccurring or escalating conflict, and adopting a holistic approach to programming that integrates prevention, peace building, and climate adaptation. Now, the tricky question in terms of the regional approach, we do have quite a few situations where a conflict or a disaster will create a displacement that crosses borders, and it will require regional response. And you have those coordination structures. There's some that are ad hoc, some that are standing, that are in place. But in terms of where we go for social protection, one of the things that I think hasn't been discussed, and I pose this to perhaps the audience and to members of the team here, is where do we go in terms of developing a regional approach commitments, perhaps, a little bit of peer pressure, standards and tools for incorporating human mobility. So migrants, displaced populations, those that cross borders, not just those within borders, into shock responsive social protection mechanisms at the national level. And what are those key actors? So I'll finish with that. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I was looking at my phone then, not because I was checking the football scores, but because I wanted to see if anybody's posed a question. So can I remind you and encourage you that if you've got burning questions after listening to people, you start posting us some questions on the chat. We will do some Q&A with the audience, but if you can post questions here, it enables me to organise them a bit and structure the Q&A a bit better. So please do go ahead. I think there's a bunch of things that come out of that for me, but one that's particularly important is that question of when does somebody stop being displaced and become part of a community? And is that when they receive social protection, or do they receive social protection before that? And so some of those questions around access to basic services that potentially imply that you are settled rather than still displaced should apply to social protection. And I don't think we're having that conversation at all. And on the regional thing, you know, for me, there is a live conversation happening about climate shocks, social protection, and how we respond to that at a regional level. So my question is, why aren't we having that regional conversation about conflict situations too? So thanks ever so much for that. We're going to have a little bit of a change now. We've talked about some really high-level big questions, and we thought it might be useful to talk about something a bit more operational that relates to all of the questions that we've been asking, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And for this, we've invited Isfari Sivalingam. Now, she works for the Better Than Cash Alliance and is going to be able to share with us some questions about how you do digital payments in situations where you're facing conflict, instability, and so on. So Isfari is the Southeast Asia lead at the UN Better Than Cash Alliance and manages both advocacy and design and implementation of technical assistance initiatives. And she's going to focus on responsible digitization. And I think for me, that word responsible really matters in a conflict-affected situation where things like trust and accountability are a critical currency for making sure that we do no harm with our programming. So over to you, Isfari.
Thank you, Rachel. And I'd like to start off also by thanking ADB for bringing us together today. It's really a pleasure to be alongside some of our members, colleagues from WFP, UNICEF, and the BARM government. In my 5 minutes, I'd like to focus on, as Rachel said, you know, the core mandate of the Alliance is accompanying our members on their transition from cash to digital payments and ensuring that this is being done responsibly. And what was really great to hear from me in the last 2 days was this increasing commitment to cash-based transfers, and going beyond that, also efforts and successes in digitizing these transfers. So I think we're well placed for this discussion on digital payments and how to do it responsibly. So as Tristan was saying, it's difficult to contain conflicts within borders, and we are also seeing as a result an increased number of forcibly displaced people, whether they're refugees or migrants. And you know, they're rather grim numbers for how these numbers are increasing year on year, and we also spoke about how these shocks are compounding with other shocks like climate change. And you know, a big number that has been predicted is that by 2050 we will have 1.2 billion people displaced globally due to climate change and natural disasters. So coming to the good news, I think compared to 2016, which was not so long ago, where there was near non-existent access to digital accounts or transaction accounts for refugees, today we have 47 countries globally that have managed to negotiate such access, and 32% of them have actually set up this access through mobile money. So there's been a significant change. And much of this also relies on really the transformational progress that we've seen at the state level on regulations, policies, infrastructure, not only around digital payments, but also national IDs, digital IDs, that are enabling such access. And Samir was saying earlier that there are many lessons from the humanitarian context that can be taken to the development one. And in this case, I think what we're seeing, in countries which are hosts to a lot of forcibly displaced people, like Jordan, for example, humanitarian agencies are actually leveraging changes in policy regulations that were actually pushed forward because of social protection needs in the country, right? So for example, UNHCR, because of a Central Bank of Jordan regulation, is now able to use UNHCR-issued IDs as proof of identity for refugees. So I think it goes both ways, and that's really remarkable. So in addition to that, we've obviously had the event COVID-19 that all of us have faced in one way or another, and while that has led to a lot of challenges, the silver lining there was that it also propelled this supercharged movement for digitization generally, and this applied also for digital payments and digitizing social protection, as well as humanitarian transfers. So a record 1,400 social protection measures were implemented, and many of them also adopted digital channels for delivery. So growth is incredible, and yet challenges remain and risks increase with any growth that we see. And for the next billion customers or individuals that we want to include in the formal financial system, like you said earlier, Rachel, there is a lack of trust. We still face a situation where women are disproportionately excluded, and their participation to be formally included actually is the single most important catalyst for reaching financial equality. And that really brings us to the UN Principles for Responsible Digital Payments that you have behind me. And there are 9 principles on the screen, and in simple terms, what these principles are saying is that digital payments, for them to work, and especially for people affected by conflict, displaced by conflict, they should be transparent, they should be accountable, they should offer recourse when they fail, because they do fail. We should prioritize women as a cornerstone in delivering these principles. And with new technologies, including the use of AI in financial services, there come risks, and so we need to accept and acknowledge these risks, and we need to have a stronger user lens in delivery of digital payments. I see that I'm almost out of time. I wanted to speak about one specific example, but I'll be happy to mention it later.
Okay, we are going to move into Q&A now, and I'm just looking for an update on your questions. Can I have a show of hands in the room? Anybody who has a question for us? Go ahead, Stephanie. Sorry, yeah, there's a mic just there in the middle of the room.
Okay. Thanks. I just wanted to reflect a little bit on, you're talking about the importance of the humanitarian development peace nexus and the need to think long term when it comes to social protection in humanitarian situations or situations of crisis. And I think one of the key challenges that we have when it comes to involving MDBs is to think about that political lens. And if we think about integrating displaced communities in social protection mechanisms and thinking about long-term institution building, there can sometimes be very key sort of political challenges to that. And I wondered if you had experience navigating that and sort of how to best think about that in an MDB context. Given we're demand-driven, we have to be responsive to the situation on the ground, and it can be quite hard to navigate that from an MDB perspective. So I guess what is the best way to navigate that, working through this channel of as a coordinated approach, given we each have strengths and weaknesses? I guess leveraging the humanitarian agency's strengths in engaging on these issues to better deliver scale social protection for these communities. Any reflections you might have on that would be very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. So we've got that question. I've also got a question online which is asking, one of the things that we heard, particularly from Samir and Jawad, was the idea that you start to create a system using your humanitarian response that then can be used to start to build a social protection program. And there's been a question, can you give any examples of that happening in practice for us? I'm just going to see if there's one more question in the audience before we respond. Do you want to come up?
Hi everyone, I'm Ingrid Fitzgerald. I'm a gender specialist with ADB, but formerly with UNFPA in Bangkok. I was really interested to hear a number of the speakers talk about how important it is to engage women, which of course I agree with, but I wanted to ask also if you could comment a bit about some of the risks of doing that, particularly in contexts like Afghanistan, and how you manage those, and how you also address some of the broader challenges that may be preventing women from accessing the support you want to provide, including violence. But there may be other risks and issues as well. Great panel, thanks everyone.
Okay, thank you. Do we want to start at one end and go down, or how about, Tristan, you respond to the question from Stephanie, and then we'll work our way back this way.
Yes, thanks, Stephanie. So I think that there are many areas of common interest when you talk about traditional donors, the banks, development institutions, humanitarian organizations, governments in the countries where you have internal displacement or receiving governments. Ongoing displacement is still a destabilization factor. And so reducing the dependency on aid, increasing the resilience, including to new displacements, is not just something that we want to do because it's important from a human rights perspective, from a human standpoint of investing in human beings, but it also makes sense from a government standpoint and from a financial standpoint. We simply cannot afford to continue the level of humanitarian assistance. That's why there has been all these discussions. So I think that there is an advocacy entry point for all of the different stakeholders to be engaging with each other, government to government, at the regional level, from donors on how best to address social protection and long-term recovery and resilience building, whether it's integrating it into policy, whether it's financing it across the board. And I think that's where we have to expand on the partnerships, not just the traditional partnerships, but really on how do we work together to address some of these needs. And I will say something basic because I have the floor, but on the development nexus, that's been a commitment that I think across the board from the World Humanitarian Summit and the Grand Bargain everywhere, that I think everyone agrees upon. But what we still see is that in many of the donors, they're still having trouble identifying those funding pockets. There's still a divide between the development funds and the humanitarian funds. And actually internally within those governments, how do they actually finance these interventions? And it might sound basic, but it's something that still has not been resolved. And so even some friendly peer pressure amongst donors might be helpful in providing some clarity so that we can really inject money in there. So that's not the stumbling block. Thank you.
Thanks. Isfari, do you want to respond to any of these?
Yes, so I quickly wanted to respond to the question on how do we actually put in place design for women, to include women, and this was the example I wanted to share. It's a helpline from Afghanistan called the Awaz Helpline, and it's used by many humanitarian agencies, and the numbers of agencies using it has increased. This helpline is open every day. It has very intentionally 50% of its operators who are women. And I think this directly responds to the fact that women in conflict situations where they're forcibly displaced face an increased risk of discrimination, gender-based violence. And so there is really a need for very specific interventions to help build their resilience. And this goes all the way to also accounting for the safety and security of the staff of us in a place like Afghanistan, where because if you want to staff women 24/7 on a hotline, this obviously poses some cultural challenges, it poses some security challenges. So Awaz has actually designed special transport to get their staff to where they need to be. So I think that's a great example of putting intention also into design and delivery of a solution.
Just some examples of what could be set up. So across the world and where WFP, just so you know, last year I think WFP transferred $3.2 billion worth of cash transfers to vulnerable individuals and households, which is not a small amount. So an example of what, let's say the building blocks of a system that can be built goes from things that in the social protection world you're also considering. Targeting and eligibility. But in conflict contexts, when you target based on poverty, there's a risk of exclusion and there's a risk of bias. So when in a humanitarian setting, we constantly grapple with this, and don't get me wrong, we haven't come to the magic bullet or the solution of it, but in discussions about inclusion and exclusion and eligibility, even on cash transfers, we go through a process of making sure that some of our criteria are quantitative, they're measurable, they're food security outcome related. Others have to be qualitative. Others have to look at that. That is something that governments will have to deal with as well because of the sheer demand and needing to be clear about eligibility for any social protection system, be that in a fragile or a non-fragile setting. Second is financial service providers. How do you deliver this? How do you contract? Procurement processes within the UN are quite cumbersome. We can imagine how difficult it is in fragile contexts when much of that bureaucracy, not without the capacity, but the capability and the ability to do it. So those processes can be transferred. Then, of course, the monitoring and the accountability and the feedback. So these are ways that we use humanitarian practice that is equally applicable to a non-humanitarian but conflict setting.
Just to add a few examples, I think one in my experience for the question on the any examples, but also with the gender and women lens, is categorical targeting or the design of the program, which means if you are targeting pregnant and lactating women and children, you know, you achieve a lot of, and you overcome a lot of barriers and risks which are in the program. First, it's very difficult to find societies or group of people which are opposed to give social protection services or cash assistance or support to this particular group. Even I think a place like Afghanistan, where there are so many restrictions, we have been able to successfully negotiate at the central level as well as at the decentralized level at the provinces that women can come and get cash for such program. So this is one example. Second, I think in the some of the examples, maybe not in the in two country contexts which I spoke, but for others, there is always an opportunity with the shock that system exists over there or program exists, and then we horizontally and vertically expand for any shock. That's also a good side of the systems or the program already existing over there. Just to give again an example in Sudan, which is very similar, not in Asia, but still relevant for us to learn. So there is a program, maternal and child cash transfer program, and then because of this conflict, that was the very first program we could now reach to more population through that program, despite all the conflict and problems in that particular context. Do not harm is my last point vis-a-vis gender and women. Sometimes it is important that we keep that in mind. You know that just to build on Samir's model, so if targeting, if design is universal, I think there is less chances of further conflict at the grassroots level, you know. So if you are covering the whole province, if you are covering the whole district, and you are not going into more targeting on any particular criteria, that will have better ownership and respect around the program in that particular situation. Thank you.
Laika, can I just tell you that there's another specific question for you online that's just asking about the... No, sure. I'm going to give you another question to respond to at the same time, if that's all right. So there's a question about BARM's pensions for people with disability, about how much you deliver.
But before I go into that, actually, I want to respond to Stephanie's question also. Resources are finite. That's a given, no? Whether it's from government or aid agencies or banks, even banks like ADB. As such, we need to be more strategic about where we are going to put in those investments. For a government body like MSSD in BARM, what we found to be useful would be the partnerships, no, that we've had with development partners who have provided catalytic support, catalytic funding to us to help us develop our new programs, to help us test models, to show proofs of concept, because once we've done that, it's easier for us to get the money from our parliament. That, in a way, it makes things easier for us. Because without that, it's quite difficult. As you said, no? It's working in government is very bureaucratic. Just purchasing one piece of pen requires so many documents. No? So that one. So more so for these new and innovative programs, it's difficult for us to, you know, to test that, even if we have, we may have the ideas, but if we do not have the resources, it's difficult to do that. For the disability allowance that you were asking, we are providing for the past 3 years. It's not that much actually. It's a little more than around $200 per year, no? But this is the first time, no? And we have adopted a system using the Washington Group something, no? Where we look at the severity of the disability to ensure that we are able to prioritize those who would need it the most.
Thank you. Now, we've got 2 minutes left. That thing's about to go red in front of me. I'm going to suggest that we don't take another round of questions and that instead we do something together. I'm going to ask each panel member to tell me in one sentence what their takeaway is from this session. And it's not something that you said, it's something that you heard somebody else say, okay? But I want to give you all the same task, and I'm going to walk through, I'm going to give you all a post-it note, and as you leave the session today, I would like you to put your post-it note on the door as you leave, and then we'll collect what are people's takeaways and see if we can figure out a way to push this agenda forwards, picking up on the things that you've highlighted. Because at the last 2019 Social Protection Week, we had a first session on climate and social protection. And suddenly, 4 years later, it is everywhere. So my goal, after having this first session on conflict, is that the next time we all meet, we're going to have an awful lot more to say, an awful lot more experience of practices that will help us all do our jobs better. So handing over, if we start at the end again with Tristan on your 1 minute, your one sentence of reflection on what you're taking away. And I will just wander through and ask you guys to start writing down. And that's the last you're going to hear from me. We'll leave Laika with the last word, okay?
I thought I was going to get a minute too. Anyway, no, I guess my big takeaway is that it's really apparent that this is at the forefront of all the different stakeholders' minds, that this is definitely a need. So that's not an argument. And that there's a lot that's actually being done. I think it needs to be more systematic. I think the partnerships need to be expanded and look at how we use different leverage points, as mentioned by Stephanie. And we need to continue to evolve in terms of looking at the layers of shocks, and perhaps not just restrict to climate, but there's slow onset, there's rapid onset disasters, and then there's displacement from conflict and how they all interface. Thank you.
So I think the big takeaway for me is that we are constantly learning from each other, and we are also able to increasingly leverage tools, processes, infrastructure that, whether it's governments that have built it for social protection needs, or humanitarian actors who are innovating and finding solutions in really difficult contexts. And I think we need to continue doing that, and that requires, sounds very simple, but really an intentional approach to sharing and learning from each other.
Thanks. A main takeaway is I'm really happy that we're having this conversation. I think it's really important. It's something that within WFP we're very much grappling with these questions. Second, I think other takeaway is it sounds like we have quite a rich experience, evidence, and practice. What it doesn't sound like, and I think you brought it up, is we're able to unlock the financing to look at this over a number of years rather than one-off investments.
Yeah, my takeaway is from Isweri's example from Jordan, where humanitarian response has actually transformed the digital payment system for whole country. And that recalls me from 2015 to 17. I think that's my one takeaway, that when humanitarian response is happening, it is a great opportunity to bring wider change in that society and in that particular component and within design of social protection programs. Thank you.
Okay. My main takeaway here really is the word bridge. Bridging. I think we need to remind ourselves that that is one of our core functions here, no? While we are here in this beautiful room, most of the communities that we serve, no, are in conflict-affected and fragile situations that may not even have a meal to eat tonight. So, looking at the lessons that have been discussed for the past 3 days, how do we translate that to programs that will actually put food on the plates of these communities whom we serve, no? Address the vulnerabilities and risks faced by women, children, PWDs, and the elderly. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Laika. I've ended up with the microphone by accident, but please post your takeaway on the door as you leave. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for all the tech team who've organised everything for us so well. My takeaway is that if you ask a panel of people to summarise their takeaway in one sentence, they'll give you 10 sentences each. But I've learned. Thank you very much, everybody.